Welcome to The Bitter Witness.
Don't be scared.
Hello, welcome back. I'm Rebecca, and I'm your host for The Bitter Witness. I hope you've had a good week. I've had a quiet week. The boys have all started heading back to school, so the house is starting to get a little quieter. But Miley, I think, has a sinus infection or something because her snoring is off the charts. Our snow is almost gone here in Ontario, but I'm sure it will come back. We're only in January. Welcome to Canada's weather. Well, that's about it for my little corner of Ontario. Let's get the business out of the way, shall we? If you like this episode or any episode, please head on over to the Patreon page and give the show some love. For less than a snore strip, you can help me to continue bringing you episodes each week. You can also support the show on Spotify, and don't forget to give the show a 5-star review over on Apple. Apparently, it helps the show in the algorithm, which I just don't get. Like, follow, and share the show on whatever platform you're listening to. Stop by our Facebook or YouTube page and leave a comment or share a post with everyone you know or don't know for that matter. Everyone is welcome here. Send a suggestion for a future episode or just drop a line and say hi, I'm listening at thebitterwitness@gmail.com. Well, that's enough of the business. Let's get to this week's case. The dogs are sleeping. Piper is behind me, but Miley is right next to me. So, puppy ASMR will not only be loud, but brought to you by both Miley and Piper this week. So grab a cup of tea, sit back, and relax as I tell you about the case of Cherrylle Dell. As always, I want to give the victims in the case top billing, but as in many of our cases, we have several victims. So, to all of those who were and are still affected by this case, I acknowledge you and send my love to you wherever you may be. This week, we look at a woman who inhabited the sacred roles of wife, mother, and lover, all pillars of love and trust. Though these roles she held in name only, she systematically dismantled the very foundations of each. Her absence of empathy was not born of ignorance, but of intent, a calculated rejection of genuine connection in favor of dominion. Driven by a nihilistic worldview that stripped human relationships of their emotional essence, she treated bonds as currency, exchanging vulnerability for control. In her hands, motherhood, a universal symbol of nurturing, became her instrument of psychological manipulation, twisting her children's realities to mold them into extensions of her will. Marriage, rather than a covenant, was a transactional gateway to resources and influence, while her entanglements with multiple lovers exposed her perverse hunger for both possession and admiration. Her sense of self thrived on the illusion of intimacy, masking her hunger for power behind the facade of love. Like a puppeteer, she manipulated lives with cold precision. Her web of deceit extended into realms as dark as murder, where betrayal oozed like a slow poison through relationships and bloodlines. Her manipulations endure, leaving behind a legacy of fractured lives and bodies. This week's case leaves us with a stark reminder that evil often wears the most tender of masks. are headed to the little town of Killaloe, Ontario this week, friends. Finally, a Canadian case. Killaloe is in the eastern part of Ontario, about 2 hours west of our country's capital, Ottawa, and about an hour south of the entrance to Algonquin Park. In 2021, the population of Killaloe was reported by Stats Canada as 487 people. It is a village. It is so small. The town was originally built in 1849, but was rebuilt in 1870 after a fire. It was mostly a logging and farming community. Although a small rural town, Killaloe does have one major claim to fame. In May of 2014, it was declared the official birthplace of the beaver tail, which, if you are Canadian, you will know that a beaver tail is a Canadian treasure. For those of you not from Canada, a beaver tail is a delectable dessert consisting of dough shaped like a beaver tail, which is fried, and then topped with many scrumptious things like chocolate hazelnut spread, bananas, whipped cream, and peanut butter. That is one of the most popular combinations. But the classic beaver tail is called the Killaloe Sunrise. This includes the toppings of cinnamon sugar with lemon juice. I'm hungry. I want a beaver tail. In 1970, a 19-year-old Scott Dell was hanging out at a party in Wilberforce, Ontario, which is another small town about an hour and a half west of Killaloe. He started to make his way across the room, and his eyes landed on a beautiful 15-year-old Cherrylle Scott. She had an unlit cigarette in her hand and was fumbling through her purse, looking for her lighter. Scott stopped in front of Cherrylle and flicked his Bic for her. Cherrylle brought the cigarette up to her lips, and as she leaned towards the flame, her and Scott's eyes met and locked. And the rest, as they say, is history. The two were together from there. Oh my God, that is so 40s film noir to have and have not, isn't it? There is nothing more sexy than a man lighting your cigarette. All I can think about is Lauren Bacall tapping her cigarette and placing it in her lips, and she just knows that Bogart will strike the match and light it for her. And their eyes lock. The intimacy, the romance. Okay, well, maybe I'm a dreamer and a romantic, but damn. Scott was absolutely in love with Cherrylle, and I don't just mean he loved her. He was intoxicated with her. Unfortunately for Scott, Cherrylle wasn't at the same level of love or infatuation. Cherrylle had had a horrible home life, according to her. She would state later that a male relative was continually sexually molesting her as she was growing up. For Cherrylle, Scott was her ticket out of that house. The young couple married on New Year's Eve 1971. Cherrylle was 17 and Scott was 20. Everything seemed to be going okay for a while, but then in 1975, Cherrylle left Scott and moved to Toronto. There doesn't seem to be any reports of why this breakup happened, simply that Cherrylle just packed up and left. When she got to Toronto, she found work as an exotic dancer, and shortly after she arrived, she discovered she was pregnant by a man she had been sleeping with in Toronto. Pregnant and alone because the baby daddy was kind of like, I'm out of here, Cherrylle went back to Scott, and he agreed to take her back and raise the baby as his own. In 1988, Scott and Cherrylle moved to the tiny rural town of Killaloe, Ontario. Scott is reported as being a social worker, a quiet and nice man who fit right in with the laid-back pace of a small-town life. Cherrylle, well, she didn't really fit into the small town. Cherrylle was described as beautiful, flirty, and outspoken. She would wear miniskirts and fishnets to run to the grocery store. She always looked put together, as they say. Makeup on and perfect. Her long red curly hair always teased up to the clouds. Shortly after they moved to Killaloe, Scott and Cherrylle began fostering special needs kids, and by this point they had 3 of their own. So needless to say, the Dells had a busy home. Eventually, Cherrylle grew tired of Scott, and she started stepping out on him, looking for a little excitement. But for Cherrylle, it was never love. The people she had the affairs with were only a way to make Scott jealous, or she needed or wanted something that they had. They served a purpose for Cherrylle, and of course, the majority of those she slept with would fall head over ass in love with her. She just had this weird power over people that no matter what she said or did, everyone wanted to be with her or believed everything she said. And Cherrylle had been honing this power for a long time. So she was really good at capturing people's hearts and keeping them until she no longer needed them. In 1992, Cherrylle started having memories, and she became absolutely 100% convinced that she had been molested by a male family member during her childhood. There are no details regarding this, and I don't believe that any charges were ever brought against anyone. Well, at least I couldn't find anything in the court records. But in Canada, a court record on child sexual assault isn't readily available, and they are ridiculously hard to find. But in any case, Cherrylle decided that in order to deal with these memories she was having, she needed to join an incest survivors group. And this is where she first met Gay Doherty. Cherrylle and Gay became fast friends, and eventually the two started having a romantic relationship behind Scott's back. Gay stated that, quote, Cherrylle was captivatingly beautiful with perfect Barbie doll looks, unquote. She said that she was immediately smitten with Cherrylle, and the romance just blossomed from there. After a while of seeing each other, Cherrylle and Gay decided to take a holiday together. So the two went to Toronto for a week and left Scott at home with their kids and the foster kids. When the two returned from their trip, Cherrylle went to Scott and told him that she wanted Gay to move into the family home. Scott refused this proposal from Cherrylle, but Scott wasn't angry with Cherrylle or Gay. He simply told Gay, "Be careful. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." Which makes me think that Scott was aware that he was being played by Cherrylle. But for Scott, to people outside the home, he would tell them that he thought that Cherrylle was just working through whatever it was that was bothering her, most likely something to do with the memories of her past trauma. Cherrylle was not impressed that Scott wouldn't let her lover move into the house with him and the kids. I mean, really, Scott? And you say you love her? That's ballsy. That move is so ballsy. Like, I don't know how big your balls would have to be to go to your spouse and tell them that you want your love partner to move into the house with everybody. Wow. Since Scott wouldn't let Gay move in with the family, Cherrylle moved out and moved in with Gay. And this is when Cherrylle began making horrible false accusations against Scott. This bitch went nuclear. She called the CAS numerous times, alleging that Scott had been sexually molesting their kids. Now, for those not in Canada, CAS is the Children's Aid Society, the equivalent of DCFS in the States. I absolutely despise the CAS here in Ontario. Not because I think they shouldn't exist. The organization does serve a very important purpose, but the system is beyond broken, and resources and supports don't go where they're needed most. I am going to stop there. Otherwise, this will be a 3-hour episode consisting of me screaming about the CAS. Needless to say, with Cherrylle making all these claims, Scott was put through pure hell, and there was no evidence that he had done anything at all. In fact, it would turn out that everything Cherrylle said about Scott was a lie. She was angry that he wouldn't allow Gay to move into the family home. So all of this shit that Scott had to live through was simply because Cherrylle was a shit bitch. And these claims weren't just that Scott had sexually assaulted their kids, which was bad enough to begin with, but Cherrylle went full tilt. She told them that she had been beaten up by Scott, which got him immediately arrested. She claimed he'd beaten up a foster child, which he hadn't. All in all, when Cherrylle was finished with all this bullshit, Scott had lost his status as a foster parent and his job, and he ended up on welfare. Not to mention that Cherrylle had been dancing around town, telling anyone who would listen to her all these lies about Scott. So his reputation in town was destroyed as well. This poor man had to live through all this bullshit. I feel so bad for him. In 1994, Scott developed a sore throat that just wouldn't go away, and then he found a lump on the inside of his throat. He went to the doctors, and it turned out that he had tongue and throat cancer. Scott told friends that he was terrified that he would lose his tongue and not be able to read his kids' stories. So he recorded himself reading books for his kids to listen to in case he lost his ability to speak or die. Oh, my heart. The doctors told Scott that his cancer was terminal. He was already at stage 4 when they found the cancer. But Scott was ready for the fight, and he fought. He did radiation treatments, went through surgeries, and Scott came through on the other side. And in January of 1995, he was in remission. But there were some lasting effects on Scott's body. He had lost the ability to taste, and he had shed 50 pounds. But he was so elated that he was going to be there for his kids. This whole fight was for his kids. During the summer that Scott was fighting for his life, Cherrylle and Gay broke up. Even though they had broken up, Gay and Cherrylle still spoke sometimes. One particular phone call that happened between the two happened when Cherrylle found out that Scott had cancer. She called Gay and was laughing and cheering and whooping it up that Scott had cancer and was gonna die. Gay, thrown off a little bit by this disgusting display of happiness by Cherrylle, knew at this point that all the accusations that Cherrylle had made about Scott were lies. And Gay was starting to think that Cherrylle was a bit of a shit bitch as well. But once this phone call happened, she was certain that Cherrylle was a horrible hag, and she started distancing herself from Cherrylle. Gay actually started hanging out with Scott, and the two got to know each other. And it wasn't long that Gay really started to realize that Scott was nothing like how Cherrylle had described him. Gay even offered to help with the kids when Scott had them. Gay loved the kids. She had lived with the kids, even if their mother was a horrible, manipulative shit pig. By the spring of 1995, Gay and Scott had become really good friends, and Cherrylle was not happy about this friendship. She called Gay over for a visit, and during the visit, she told Gay all new lies about Scott and how horrible a person he was. She ended the visit by telling Gay she needed to stay away from Scott. But Gay just ignored Cherrylle and continued her friendship with Scott. If you ask me, it sounds like Cherrylle was a little scared that Gay and Scott might start comparing notes and find out exactly how bad of a hag she was. It was about the same time that Scott and Gay were developing a friendship that Cherrylle answered a personals ad and started dating 37-year-old Nancy Fillmore. Nancy and Cherrylle met, and just like Scott, Nancy instantly fell hard for Cherrylle. To one friend, Nancy described meeting Cherrylle as destiny. Nancy fell fast and hard. Adding to that, Cherrylle informed her of all the horrible things that Scott had done to her and to the kids. And Nancy not only believed every lie that Cherrylle spewed, but felt as though she and Cherrylle had been brought together so that she could protect Cherrylle and the kids. Barf. One of the ways that Cherrylle was able to get things that she wanted was by deceit. She had told people throughout her life that she had chronic health issues, and of course that she suffered with horrific chronic pain that just couldn't be managed through medicine. That's not how that works. Anything can be managed through strong enough meds, Cherrylle. And there was nothing wrong with Cherrylle. She was perfectly healthy. An example of this, she befriended a couple in town. And when I say befriend, I mean bewitched, manipulated, deceived. Oh, there are just so many words I could use here. This couple, the Knotts, and I really couldn't find that much information on them other than their names. The Knotts felt bad for Cherrylle and did anything and everything to help her. They would have Cherrylle and the kids over, so much so that the kids and Cherrylle had their own rooms inside the Knotts' home. Scott would even sometimes have his visits with the kids at the Knotts' house. Mrs. Knott would testify later that Cherrylle did nothing but talk shit about Scott. That was until he came for his visits with the kids, and then on a dime, Cherrylle would change into this sickly, sweet woman when interacting with Scott. According to Mrs. Knott, at bedtime, the kids were given cough syrup to make them sleep. Cherrylle told her that if she didn't give the kids the medicine, they wouldn't sleep. But here's the thing. The kids would wet the bed during the night because Cherrylle would give them way too much medicine. So this piece of shit is literally dosing her kids so she could go have her nights to do whatever she wanted. Oh my God, I want to punch this woman in the face with a chair. Shortly after Nancy and Cherrylle started dating, they moved in together. And in October of 1995, the family cat died. According to Nancy, Cherrylle was not upset in any way. Like, not even a tear was shed by this bitch. Nancy and Cherrylle had taken the cat to the vet, and the vet told them that the cat most likely had found some antifreeze somewhere and ingested it. Cherrylle wasn't concerned about figuring out where the antifreeze was that the cat had gotten, she was fascinated about the antifreeze killing the cat and started asking the vet all sorts of creepy questions, like, would antifreeze kill a human? And how much antifreeze did the cat have to ingest in order for it to die? Okay. I would be in tears that my cat was dead, but I guess we're not all the same. On December 29th, 1995, Gay went to her friend Scott's house to pick him up. Gay and Scott were going to take his kids out shopping, but he hadn't met them at Cherrylle's. Gay decided to go check on Scott. Even though Scott was in remission, she still worried. Gay knocked on the front door, but there was no answer. She went around the back of the house and found Scott's back door unlocked, which, according to Gay, was really weird for Scott. Gay went inside and saw that on his desk was a bottle of wine that was about half empty and a glass with remnants of the wine from the bottle. Gay kind of wondered about the remaining wine inside the bottle. The color was off. It almost looked neon yellowish green with an oily substance on the top, but she didn't know how long the bottle had been sitting there, and there was also some papers with writing on them. They looked like letters scattered about on the desk. Gay picked up one of the letters and tried to read what was on it. It seemed to be a love letter to Cherrylle, but the handwriting was not neat. It looked as if Scott was extremely drunk when he had written it. The letters didn't really make sense either. What Gay could make out were random words and unfinished thoughts. This all just made Gay even more worried about Scott. She figured he must have been a little depressed about the divorce coming up and had gotten really drunk when he wrote these. The only sound in the house was a needle playing the static sound that happens when the record has played all the way through and it's that one part at the end near the middle. But other than that, the entire house was dead quiet. She called Scott's name. Nothing but static. And this is when I would run for the nearest door and call the police. But not Gay. She made her way through the house, calling out Scott's name. Nothing. She looked into Scott's room. There she found him lying on the floor, partially clothed, and he appeared to have thrown up where he laid. Scott was dead. Gay called 911. She told the police that she figured Scott had probably died from the throat cancer, that maybe he hadn't beaten it as everyone had thought he had. The police agreed with Gay and figured this was probably what had happened. They notified the family and basically closed the case, just waiting for the autopsy results to come in. When the autopsy results came in, they stated that Scott had died from ethylene glycol poisoning. He had ingested enough antifreeze to cause metabolic acidosis, multi-organ failure, and finally, cardiopulmonary collapse. Of course, I'm going to tell you what that is. Metabolic acidosis is when your liver metabolizes the ethylene glycol and turns it into extremely toxic, acidic byproducts. The main byproduct is glycolic acid. Once the glycolic acid has entered the blood, it introduces excess hydrogen into the blood, which in turn severely lowers the blood's pH levels. Once the blood's pH levels have plummeted, the body will send a message to the brain telling it to try to expel the extra acid in your body by breathing faster and deeper, something called Kussmaul respiration. Blood pressure will plummet and the acidosis will affect the brain's normal functioning, causing headache, blurred vision, dizziness, and eventually the person will become comatose. One by one, organs will fail as the organs stop receiving their messages to function. until the person dies. So long story short, an absolutely horrific, terrifying death. The wine bottle from his desk also came back from the lab with gobs of antifreeze in it. The police made the obvious assumption regarding Scott's death. It had to be a suicide. There was the wine bottle, love letters to his wife, who he was going through a divorce with. He had been suffering from the throat cancer and all the physiological effects from the cancer and the treatments. Anyone would make this assumption. But then the medical examiner informed the police that at the time of his death, there was absolutely no trace whatsoever of cancer inside Scott's body. This caused the police to pause, but they figured that perhaps Scott believed that the cancer had come back or was going to come back, and he just couldn't deal with that possibility. Along with everything else he was dealing with, the police decided that suicide was the most plausible answer, and they closed the case. Everyone moved on. That was until March of 1997. Kim Meisel was concerned about her friend Nancy. Nancy seemed to be headed into a downward spiral. She had been seeing Cherrylle, but they had broken up. Kim was worried that Nancy had suffered some domestic violence or something. She had seen bruises on Nancy, and added to the change in Nancy's personality, she decided it was time to offer some help to her friend. Kim invited Nancy for a boat ride. She figured it was the perfect secluded and private place to try and connect with Nancy. When Kim gently broached the subject of the state Nancy was in, Nancy started to shake and cry. Kim looked at Nancy and said, "For God's sake, Nancy, if you've got something inside, just friggin' say it." Nancy stared at Kim and blurted out, "I could have stopped it. He'd still be alive if I would have stopped it." I don't think that was exactly what Kim was banking on when she took Nancy out for a boat ride, but... On March 17th, 1997, St. Patrick's Day, after some convincing from Kim, Nancy walked into the OPP station and asked to speak to the new detective, Ken Leppert. The desk clerk explained to Nancy that Detective Leppert was just finishing his shift and about to leave, but Nancy was insistent. She had to speak to the new detective. She had very important information to tell him. Leppert begrudgingly agreed to speak with the crazy woman at the desk, thinking it would probably be a short conversation, as nothing really huge ever happened in Killaloe. Little did he know that the story he was about to hear was unlike anything he had ever heard before or would again. Nancy told Leppert that she was there to speak about a woman named Cherrylle Dell. Leppert could see Nancy was upset. She was shaking, wringing her hands as she spoke. Leppert asked her why she insisted on speaking with him. Nancy's answer was, "Because she couldn't have gotten to you yet. You're new to town." According to Nancy, Cherrylle was guilty of several crimes. She had opened lines of credit under fake names. She had reported several false break-ins to collect insurance money, and that was just the tip of the iceberg. Leppert realized that the woman sitting across from him spewing all of these allegations was probably completely insane or just wanted to get her ex in trouble and had concocted this entire outrageous story. Leppert asked Nancy if she had any proof of these claims she was making. Nancy told him that she did not. Leppert calmly and politely told Nancy that without any hard proof, there was really nothing he could do about any of this. At that, Nancy burst into hysterical tears and sobbed, "I just feel so bad about what happened next. I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life." At this outburst, Leppert couldn't help himself. He had to know, so he asked Nancy what she was talking about. Nancy said, "I can't tell you because I'll incriminate myself. But Cherrylle has a bunch of my things and I want them back, and she owes me a bunch of money. Would you help me get my stuff back?" Leopard agreed to help Nancy get her stuff back. He really couldn't do anything about the money that was owed to her, but I think Leopard kind of felt bad for Nancy, thinking she was just a broken-hearted, crazy woman who probably had been dumped by this Cherrylle Dell woman. So the next day, Leopard met Nancy at Cherrylle's house. Leopard knocks on the door, and Cherrylle answers all sweet and nice, "Well, hello, Mr. Officer. How can I make your day?" type of thing. And then Cherrylle's gaze moved over Leopard's shoulder, and she saw Nancy standing behind him. Cherrylle's demeanor changed instantly. This sickly, sweet, flirty woman who answered the door disappeared in a flash. What's she doing here? Leopard was taken back a little by the speed at which Cherrylle was able to switch her personality. He explained that he was there to try and mediate between her and Nancy so that Nancy could get some of her things back. Cherrylle was fuming. She turned and stormed into the house. Leopard and Nancy could hear banging and crashing coming from inside the house. A few minutes later, Cherrylle reappeared at the front door, carrying 2 garbage bags. She threw the bags past Nancy and screamed, "There's your stuff. Get off my property." When Nancy opened the bags, anything that was inside the bags was either soiled or broken. Not only did it look like Cherrylle had been slamming the garbage bags against a wall in order to break everything, but she had used nasty old garbage bags that already had rotten garbage inside them to collect Nancy's stuff. You smell that? That is bullshit right there, my friends. Breaking a couple things of your exes when they come to pick them up, okay, that's kind of expected, especially if you had a bad breakup. But to open old garbage bags and filled with rotting food that have been sitting around and put their stuff in those and then break everything inside, that's a whole nother level of dick move. As Leopard was gently guiding Nancy back to the car, Nancy whirled around and screamed back at the house, "This isn't over, Cherrylle." After a few seconds, she turned to Leopard and said, "Okay, I'll tell you. That woman is dangerous. Her ex-husband didn't commit suicide. She killed him." Leopard pulled Nancy a little closer and said, "Nancy, if you're serious about what you just said, we need to go back to the station, and you have to make a formal statement." Nancy agreed, and Cherrylle was beyond furious. She started screaming from the porch as Leopard put Nancy in his car. "She's crazy. You don't listen to anything she says. She's a fucking psycho." Back at the station, Nancy told Leopard that Cherrylle never had any plans to get back together with Scott. In fact, she despised him. She had been trying to come up with ways to get all the money, the farm, and the kids. When Scott had been diagnosed with stage 4 throat cancer, Cherrylle believed that she had won the lottery. All she had to do was stop the divorce and wait until Scott died, and she would get everything she wanted. See, if Nancy was still married to Scott when he died from cancer, she would automatically inherit everything. But if they were divorced, she would only get half of what Scott had. But when Cherrylle found out that Scott was in remission, she was livid, fuming that he just wouldn't die and that this stupid cancer was taking too long to kill him. She literally lost her ever-loving mind. And that is when Cherrylle decided to take things into her own hands. After Christmas, Cherrylle invited Scott over to allow him to visit with the kids while they opened the presents from him. Cherrylle gave Scott a Christmas present, a 1.5-liter bottle or what we Canadians would call a magnum, of his favorite wine, Pierre d'Or. She told Scott that day that she had had a dream the night before that he was drinking the wine, listening to their music, and they were talking on the phone about their future together. She told Scott that she was done with Nancy and feeling as though the two of them could work through their problems and maybe look at a reconciliation. When Scott heard this, he was so happy. He still loved Cherrylle after everything she had done to him, and he wanted nothing else than to be back with her and the kids so they could be a family again. Cherrylle gave him the bottle of wine, told him to go home, put on their music, drink the wine, and call her later. That way, the two of them could have a private and longer conversation about reconciliation. Later that evening, Scott pulled out his Traffic and Linda Ronstadt albums, dropped the needle, pulled out his writing paper, poured a glass of wine, and picked up the phone to call Cherrylle. Nancy told Leppert that Cherrylle stayed on the phone with Scott that night for almost 9 hours. She kept telling him to drink the wine and to read her another of his love poems he was writing for her. As Scott was writing and reading his letters through the entire 9-hour call, Scott was drinking more and more of the wine. Cherrylle would say every so often, "Scott, are you still there? Write down what you dream of for our future together, what you want to happen. Read them to me, and take a drink of wine." These are some of the things that Scott wrote and read to Cherrylle over the phone. Quote, "I feel like holding you close to me like never before. I feel like making love to you. I feel like all the bad stuff would go away." Unquote. A little later in the phone call, he wrote this, quote, "What do you think was going to happen if I drank a bottle of wine, listening to music we used to listen to? I'm going to think about you and me together." Unquote. By 4 a.m., Scott was almost incapacitated. He and Cherrylle hung up, but before he did, he told her he was having a vision of her as an angel. Cherrylle told Scott, "My angel spirit will take you to heaven." With that, the call ended. Nancy broke down in heavy sobs at this point in her statement. Leppert took a breath and asked, "How do you have all this information? How do you know what they were saying on the phone that night?" Nancy wiped the tears from her eyes and said, "I was listening on the extension for the entire call." Not only had she heard the call, but she had actually helped Cherrylle plan and execute the entire murder. Nancy stated that Cherrylle had come up with the idea to use antifreeze in the wine when the cat died. She knew that Scott wouldn't be able to taste the antifreeze because of the treatments for his cancer, and it was Nancy that had bought the antifreeze to use in the wine. Nancy stated that she had watched Cherrylle pour the antifreeze into the wine bottle and then wrap it in Christmas paper. Cherrylle had decided that if she could keep Scott on the phone for long enough, she could make sure he was drinking the poisoned wine and that Scott wouldn't be able to call for help. Nancy told Leppert that she had actually tried to talk Cherrylle out of killing Scott because the whole idea was freaking her out. But Cherrylle would just tell Nancy to shut the fuck up and do what she was told. Cherrylle informed Nancy that if Nancy ratted her out or did anything to screw up the plan, Cherrylle would go to the cops and tell them that it was Nancy who had orchestrated the entire murder, that Nancy was jealous of Scott because she was in love with Cherrylle, and Cherrylle told her, "They'll believe me. I can make them believe me." Nancy said that after that threat, she just did whatever Cherrylle told her to do. Leppert took all of this in and asked Nancy why she had sat on all this for 2 years. and then all of a sudden decide that now was the time to come clean. The story that Nancy had spewed was a little hard for Leppert to believe, especially in a small town of Killaloe. Leppert was thinking maybe Nancy was just an ex-lover who had been jilted and killed Scott and was trying to get back at Cherrylle by placing the blame on her for Scott's death. Nancy told Leppert that at the time of Scott's murder, she hated Scott. Cherrylle had told Nancy that the reason she left Scott was because Scott had been physically and sexually abusing their kids for years. And Nancy believed Cherrylle about all this, and so she was fine with Cherrylle wanting to murder Scott. But now, after Cherrylle and Nancy's relationship had ended, Nancy stated that she no longer believed Cherrylle and that she figured that Scott was just a nice guy who had fallen into Cherrylle's web. Leppert asked what had happened that made Nancy change her mind about Cherrylle, and that is when Nancy told him about Bajula. Hold on to your asses, folks, because this next part is perhaps the most evil, gross, diabolical thing I have ever come across. And I've seen some shit. During Nancy and Cherrylle's relationship, Cherrylle had reported her infant daughter, named Bajula, had been kidnapped. But in actuality, there had never been a baby named Bajula. Leppert shook his head a little and asked for some clarification. According to Nancy, at one point in their relationship, Cherrylle decided she wanted to have a baby. But not just any baby. She wanted to have a baby who was black. Cherrylle decided to claim that she had had a baby with a Jamaican man and that the baby had been kidnapped shortly after birth. Cherrylle figured that if the police were able to find a baby matching the description she gave for her non-existent child, they would bring her the baby and she would have the baby that she wanted. But Cherrylle had a little problem. Her 3 other children would know that she hadn't had a baby. I don't know how she did it. And quite honestly, I don't really want to know, but somehow Cherrylle was able to convince or cajole her children that she not only had been pregnant, gave birth to a girl, but that baby girl, Bajula, had been kidnapped. Cherrylle actually made a report to the police that her daughter had been kidnapped. She even had a fake birth certificate and photos of a black baby girl who she told the police was Bajula. The police believed Cherrylle and started an investigation looking for the missing baby. Is that not the most evil thing you have ever heard of? Like, ever? Oh my God, what if they had found a baby that matched the description and took it away from its parents and gave it to Cherrylle? Could you imagine? Don't forget, DNA was still in its infancy at this point, so there would just be no tests that they could do to prove whose baby it was. Calculating, diabolical. There aren't enough words to describe how evil this shit bitch is. Next, Nancy told Leppert that after the cat had died from antifreeze poisoning, Cherrylle had gone to a phone booth and called the Poison Control Center. She gave them a fake name, Ms. Balding, and told them that her brother Gerald had drank about 2 cups of antifreeze, that he weighed about 130 pounds. Cherrylle asked if the amount of antifreeze could be fatal for the 130-pound Gerald. The poison control person told her that yes, it was, and she needed to get Gerald to a hospital immediately. Nancy told Leppert that this was research. She wanted to make sure she used enough antifreeze to kill Scott. Leopard asked Nancy if she was willing to testify to everything she had just told him, and Nancy told him, "Absolutely, I have to face the consequences of what I've done." Leopard met with his partner, a Detective Sears, to go over everything that Nancy had stated and figure out what their next steps were going to be. While they were talking, they received a phone call from a hysterical Cherrylle, pleading with them to get over to her house immediately. Leopard and Sears rushed to Cherrylle's. When they arrived, she was on the porch, screaming for them to hurry up, get up here. They ran to the porch, where Cherrylle was pointing to a tiny puddle of oil. She started screaming, "Nancy did this. She tried to kill me by trying to burn my house down. Look, look!" The detectives looked from the puddle of oil back to Cherrylle and informed her that they didn't think that anyone had tried to burn her house down, and that the tiny little puddle of oil most likely wouldn't have sent her house up in smoke. Cherrylle stood quiet for a moment, looking from one detective to the other, and then she blurted out, "Nancy has been stealing my money from my bank accounts and using my credit cards. In fact, I just had to close one of my accounts this morning." Leopard said, "Give me the proof and we'll start an investigation." Cherrylle ran into the house and came back with a bunch of paperwork, handing it all to Leopard. Leopard thanked her and then turned to head back to the car. But before he could get off the porch, Cherrylle transformed into what looked like a woman trying to bed a man. She got real close to Leopard, pushing her boobs into his chest, and said, "You know, all the neighbors have been asking who the handsome new detective was that's been coming around here so often." Leopard looked down at Cherrylle and said, "Well, that's not me," and turned and left the porch. Good for you, Leopard. Okay, let's stop here for a second and take stock of what just transpired on Cherrylle's porch. Cherrylle was panicked because Nancy showed up with a cop, and in front of Cherrylle, Nancy told that cop that Cherrylle had murdered Scott. So that immediately sent Cherrylle into damage control mode. She first tries to discredit Nancy with the cops by making her out to be a murderer, by pouring a little bit of oil on the floor and crying arson and attempted murder. When that didn't work, she immediately went to theft and fraud. Then, when that allegation didn't have the detectives running off to arrest Nancy with sirens blaring, she pulled out her old tried and true tool, seduction. We can assume that because all three of these tools failed miserably for her, that she is now just about ready to unleash the Kraken mad. Leopard and Sears headed back to the station and started looking into this theft and fraud allegation made by Cherrylle against Nancy. And as we all probably figured out, everything Cherrylle had said was false. None of the accounts were closed, and there were no purchases on the credit card, so nobody was using the credit cards. Leopard and Sears figured that at this point they really needed to speak with Gay Doherty, but she was nowhere to be found in Killaloe. They eventually found Gay living in Quebec. When Leopard and Sears arrived at Gay's house, they asked her why she had left town. Gay told them that she was actually in hiding from Cherrylle. Gay told them that after Scott had died, she had tried to visit with Dell's kids, but Cherrylle wouldn't allow it, and that each time she tried, Cherrylle would just get madder and madder. Then one night, Gay was in bed reading, and she heard some noises outside her bedroom. When she opened her door, she was met with a wall of flames. She called 911, but she knew she had to get out of that house before the fire department arrived, or she wouldn't survive. Luckily, Gay had a pitcher of water in her room, so she doused a blanket and threw it over her head and ran through the flames to escape. Gay ran out to the end of her driveway to flag down the fire trucks, and while she was waiting for them, she noticed there was a note taped to her mailbox. It read, "Stay away from Cherrylle's kids." After that night, she moved as fast and as far away as she could. Cherrylle started dating some creepy loser from town named Chris Mickle. One night, early in the summer of '97, Nancy was at home and she heard breaking glass from downstairs. When she got down there and looked out on her lawn, there was Cherrylle's new boyfriend standing on her lawn, swinging a baseball bat, screaming, "Get out here and take what's coming to you, bitch." Nancy called the police, and they came and arrested the genius on the lawn. Leppert and Sears came out to Nancy's house and told her that she should really get out of town for a while, at least until the case was settled. Cherrylle was a dangerous woman, and they didn't want to see anything happen to Nancy. But Nancy wasn't about to cower to Cherrylle, and she refused to leave town. "Leppert, if you are so concerned about Nancy's safety, why are you not putting her somewhere safe? Why are you leaving it all on Nancy?" Now that Cherrylle's genius boyfriend was in jail, Cherrylle needed to find herself a new puppet to do her bidding. So Cherrylle found herself a new group of friends to hang out with. Teenagers. Yep, you heard me. Teenagers. At this point in the timeline, Cherrylle is in her 40s, and she had somehow befriended a bunch of teens and would just let them hang out at her house. She would buy them booze and weed, and they literally could just do whatever they wanted at Cherrylle's. One of the teens, Brent Crawford, took a more personal liking to Cherrylle, and Cherrylle, of course, returned the affection, sexually. Now, at the time, Crawford was 16 years old, and let me remind you, Cherrylle, the shit bitch, was in her 40s. Ew. Now, in Canada, the general age of consent is 16, but there are exceptions to the rule. Under the law, there cannot be consent given if one of the partners is 16 and the other is a person in a role of trust or authority, things like that. But technically, there was no law broken here, other than morality. In August of 1997, Detective Leppert's phone rang in the middle of the night, and that is never a good thing. He was told to get over to Nancy Fillmore's house immediately. It was on fire. When he arrived at Nancy's house, he was informed that Nancy's burned remains had been found inside the house. Leppert was devastated and felt responsible for Nancy's death. You kind of in a little bit of a way were, dude. You didn't hide her. Nancy's testimony was the main evidence against Cherrylle, and now Leppert had nothing. Leppert was more determined than ever to arrest Cherrylle. He and Sears decided to pull the case file from Scott's death. When they pulled out the officer's notes from that night, they found the interview with Cherrylle. According to the officer's notes, Cherrylle had been talking with Scott on the phone until 4 a.m., and at the time that they had hung up, he was fine and chipper. Cherrylle told the officer that Scott had found out that day that his cancer had returned, but that he was more determined than ever to fight it, but that Scott had sworn her to secrecy about the cancer. Cherrylle had told the officer that Scott had weighed 250 pounds before he got cancer, and that the disease and the treatments had taken him down to 130, which he did not weigh 130 at his death. He weighed 200 or 180, between there, somewhere around there, but he was nowhere near 130 pounds. Next, Leppert went to the Poison Control Center. They had a record of a call regarding a Ms. Balding shortly before Scott had died, whose younger brother, Gerald, had ingested about 2 cups of antifreeze. This Ms. Balding had told the operator that her brother, Gerald, weighed 130 pounds. The operator at the poison control had followed up with the hospital to see if Gerald was okay, only to find out that not only did no one named Gerald come to the hospital that night, but no one came into the hospital who had accidentally drank antifreeze. Leppert realized and was convinced that Cherrylle had killed Scott, and he was sure that she had at least something to do with Nancy's death. Leppert and Sears started poking around town, asking if anyone knew who Cherrylle had been seeing, now that genius Chris Mickle was in jail. And the word on the street led the detectives to the teens, and specifically to Brent Crawford. Apparently, Crawford had a big mouth and had been bragging about how he had killed Nancy for his girlfriend Cherrylle, and that Cherrylle was going to buy him a motorcycle and give him $300 cash on top of that. Leppert and Sears went looking for Crawford, only to find out that he had conveniently taken off on a hitchhiking trip across Canada. And I'm sure Cherrylle had nothing to do with setting that trip in motion. Leppert and Sears put out a nationwide alert for Crawford. After a couple of days, they received word that he had been spotted in northern Ontario hitchhiking. So Leppert got an undercover officer to pose as a truck driver to go find Crawford. And now, my friends, it is the time for one of my all-time favorite police tactics ever, a Mr. Big operation. Woohoo! So we have to stop for a couple of things. One, you're probably wondering, how in the hell is an undercover agent going to find a 16-year-old kid who is hitchhiking across Canada? Well, we have this road in Canada called the Trans-Canada Highway. It literally runs from one side of the country to the other. And if you're going to hike across Canada or thumb your way across Canada, you follow this road. Because if you stray away from this road, you will die. Well, okay, you might not die, but along most of the Trans-Canada Highway, other than the road itself, there is nothing but bush and giant mountains and lakes, no people, no stores, no lights, just trees, animals, and dark. If you were to drive the Trans-Canada Highway straight from one end to the other, it would take about 100 hours of driving the speed limit. But that's driving straight for 100 hours. When you add in breaks and stops and sleep, the total trip would take you between 2 and 3 weeks. I really want to do this one day before I die. Go from one end to the other of this wonderful country I live in. It would be an amazing trip. Number 2, the Mr. Big operation. In the States, this type of undercover operation is illegal. It's considered entrapment. But here in Canada, well, I guess we figure if you're dumb enough to fall for it, you deserve to go to jail. It's an undercover operation where a police officer poses as a criminal and pretends to want to recruit someone. But in order to be recruited, the person has to prove that they are worthy to join a criminal organization, either by way of evidence or telling all of the illegal things that they have done. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Thank God for stupid criminals. So the undercover officer takes off, posing as a truck driver, and after a few days, he finds Crawford hitchhiking. He picks him up, and the two start talking. The undercover tells Crawford that he is on his way to BC to work for his brother, and that if Crawford wants, he could get him a job too, but Crawford would have to be okay with the job being kind of illegal. And Crawford starts singing like a bird. He tells the undercover officer that he is totally fine with something illegal, And to prove it, let me tell you every single detail of how I killed a woman back in my hometown and got away with it. You've known this man for literally 30 seconds, and you're going to tell him your entire life story. Crawford informs the undercover officer that he went to Nancy's house and he was going to slice her throat. But when he got there, she was passed out on the couch sleeping, and he noticed that there were candles on the coffee table. So he thought, I don't really want to get blood on me, so I'll just light the house on fire, and that's exactly what he did. He told the undercover that he stayed in the house for a little bit to make sure that Nancy didn't wake up and that any evidence of his existence or being in that house also caught on fire. Once he was sure that everything went as his girlfriend wanted, he left. Crawford was arrested at the next truck stop, and the recording of his telling of the murder of Nancy was handed over to the prosecutor's office. Dumb ass. When asked during his interrogation why he would do something like this, Crawford told the officers that he, quote, did it for love, unquote. When Crawford murdered Nancy, he and Cherrylle had only been having a sexual relationship for 3 weeks. I love Mr. Big Operations. Love, love, love. Crawford was convicted of the murder of Nancy Fillmore and sentenced to life in prison with no parole for 10 years. In 2010, Crawford was granted a weekend pass from prison because he had been so good in jail. But then he failed to return to prison at the end of the pass. He was out for a few months, but he was recaptured in February 2011, and as far as I can tell, he's still in prison to this day, but I couldn't find anything saying he was paroled. But here in Canada, things like that, they just are not publicized. It's really hard to find information on convicts here in Canada. Once Crawford was in custody, Leppert and Sears received the arrest warrant for Cherrylle, which they were only too happy to serve on her. Cherrylle Dell was arrested, charged, and convicted for Scott's murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with no parole for 25 years. She appealed her sentence but was denied. She applied for parole after 25 years but was denied a couple of times. Now, I couldn't find any official reports saying that she had been released, but I did find something that said she had been released from prison in 2024 and is living in the Kitchener-Waterloo area currently, which is not that far from where I live, and I have friends that live there. So, friends, I know you're listening. Be careful. I mean, you never really know your neighbors, do you? And that, my friends, is the case of Cherrylle Dell. My thoughts. There is culpability all throughout this case, but the majority of it rests squarely on Cherrylle, whose actions paint the picture of a deeply calculating and manipulative individual who viewed every person not as a human being, but as a pawn in her cruel, self-serving game. To her, relationships were transactional, emotions were tools, and the damage she inflicted carried no weight. She operated without remorse or conscience, leaving shattered lives in her wake. As for Nancy, I have sympathy, but not empathy. She did eventually express remorse and went to the police, but her decision came only when she could no longer endure Cherrylle's wrath, not out of moral conviction. She had countless opportunities to stop Scott's murder before it happened. She could have walked away, warned Scott, or hey, I don't know, called the police. But instead, she chose complicity. As for Crawford, yes, he was only 16 and under Cherrylle's toxic influence. But you cannot tell me that a 16-year-old doesn't know the fundamental wrong of taking a life. Again, sympathy is due for his youth and manipulation, but not full absolution. The true victims, however, are the children, innocent and exploited, psychologically tormented by their own mother, forced to weaponize lies against their father. The oldest daughter's testimony about being coerced into vilifying her father was heartbreaking and enraging. The level of manipulation inflicted on these kids is monstrous. It makes me want to vomit. My hope is that these kids were placed with someone who loved them and supported them and were able to facilitate healing from these deep emotional scars that Cherrylle inflicted on them. Wow, what a shit bitch. It makes me, so sick that this bitch is Canadian and that she is out of prison and possibly living in a community where I actually have friends. I really hope she has changed her ways, but I seriously doubt it. Once a shit bitch. With that, I think we'll leave it there for this week. Stay safe, get your pap test done, and enjoy your day today. This has been a Bitter Witness production.